Introducing Kyrill Potapov, who we've got a lot to thank for because he's the key organiser of this conference, and he's going to be speaking on From Bee to Architect, Social Form and the Development of Mind.
Thanks. So I'm a human-computer interaction researcher, and this talk is a bit of an apologia for my own work. As a starting point, I want to take Marx's famous suggestion that what distinguishes the worst of architect from the best of bees is that the architect builds the cell in his mind before he constructs it in wax. So there's something striking about this passage in Capital, which is why it's become so popular, but there's also something quite problematic, and there are a number of aspects we can dwell on, but it's Marx taking a romantic idea, it's pretty much paraphrasing Herder, and one criticism which I think is important to note here has been a criticism against the Enlightenment as a whole, is that if we do draw this distinction, that here's this very special thing that an architect is doing with their mind, that we then are forced to ask questions about who is and is not a person, and about the kind of distinction between people and animals. So Marx says, at the end of every labour process, a result emerges which had already been conceived by the worker at the beginning, hence already existed ideally. So this is a particular vision of what people are doing, and lots of people have sort of rejected Marxist thought, and indeed Enlightenment thought as a whole, very much motivated by the suggestion that we get into a sort of a slippery slope, or that we discount certain kinds of people or certain ways of engaging with the world if we go down that road. I'm going to draw on people who often are thought of as themselves falling foul of this problem, Ilyenkov and Wilfrid Sellars, to show that we can guard against this as a worry, while also defending an understanding of the person and the human. So Ilyenkov directly defends Marx's statement here in, I think, a very creative way. So just first, as a basic thing for Ilyenkov, we have this understanding of psychology whereby the most fundamental level, as a prerequisite for psyche, what do we mean by like the architect forming an image or the bee forming an image? Well, the image is the schema corrected by the form of the obstacle to its actualization. It's the representation of the form of the object, the form of the action. So to a bird, ripples in the water are an image representation sign of a fish. That's the kind of way, because the bird has certain subjective needs, certain concerns, this is what it's seeing, and it doesn't need to construct the image any more than aligns it to the fish in its activity. At this point, Ilyenkov says, there proves to be no fundamental difference between the architect and the bee. A cell made of wax, which a bee sculpts, has its prime moment in the form of the activity of an insect. In this sense, the product of a bee's activity is also fixed ideally prior to its real actualization. So what actually is the difference? Ilyenkov suggests, paraphrasing Marx, the human being and only the human being immediately ceases to merge with the form of her life activity, separating it from itself and placing it before herself, that is, transforming it into representation. So I'm going to unpack a bit what that could mean. Now, of course, already we see resonances with Sellars in a number of places. I'd like to pick out this quote from his early essay, Language, Rules and Behavior. Above the foundation of man's learned responses to environmental stimuli, let us call this his tied behavior. The Tao is a superstructure of more or less developed systems of rule-regulated symbol activity which constitutes man's intellectual vision. It is in terms of such systems of rule-regulated symbol activity that we are to understand an Einstein's grasp of alternative structures of natural law, a Leibniz's vision of the totality of all possible worlds, etc. Such symbol activity may well be characterized as free, or as the basis of freedom. Okay, so this is one way to pass what Marx was interested in. It, of course, doesn't move us any further in terms of the central question, which is about who is a person who gets to count in that category. And for that, I'd like to spend a bit of time on the psychologist Lev Vygotsky. So at the start of his career, Vygotsky was a secondary school teacher in Gomel in Belarus. He joined the Bolshevik government in Belarus and then went to Moscow wanting to be part of the restructuring of society as part of the revolution, based on his experiences of Gomel, of the street children in Gomel and the children's homes there. And I'd like to share something which Vygotsky presented to the committee in charge of education, to the Central Committee at a congress there. Okay. It is in our hands to make sure that a deaf, blind, or cognitively impaired child is not disabled. Then this very concept, a sure sign of our own defect, will disappear. Blindness in itself does not make a child disabled. It becomes this only under certain social conditions of the blind person's existence. It is a sign of the dislocation of his behavior from the behavior of others, the degeneration and displacement of social ties and conditions which ought to ground adaptive reactions to the environment. In the crude physical medical model, blindness simply meant the absence of sight, deafness of hearing, but the defect of man can never affect the personality directly, because the eye and ear are not only his physical organ, but also his social organ. The problem of children's disability in psychology and pedagogy must be seen as a social problem. So Vygotsky gave this presentation once at a congress, and it was met with confusion, anger. He then gave the presentation, slightly adapted form, a second time, and he became the head of disabled education in the Soviet Union and had a dramatic role over a period of about 7 years on how disability was understood there. And the basic kernel of that is one which Vygotsky describes as a Hegelian Marxist one. Let us take the first pointing gesture of the child. The gesture is nothing other than an unsuccessful grasping movement. The child stretches out his hand towards a distant object and cannot reach it, but his hand remains stretched out towards the object. Then the following occurs. The mother hands the child the object. For her, rather than for the child, the unsuccessful grasping movement is converted into a pointing gesture, because she understands it in this way. This movement objectively turns ever more into a pointing gesture. This stage can be called the pointing gesture for others. Only significantly later does the action become a pointing gesture for the self, that is, a conscious and deliberate action of the child. Likewise, the child's first words, nothing other than an effective cry. Objectively, they express one need or another of the child long before the child consciously uses them as a means of expression. Again, as before, others, not the child, fill these effective words with certain implications. Then, gradually, to the extent that operation is assimilated by the child, to the extent that it grows into the general structure of his thinking, it loses its external character and becomes his internal property, an inalienable part of his personality. So, one second. Back to language rules and behavior. As children, we learn to understand the noise blue in much the same way as the dog learns to understand the noise bone. But we leave the dog behind in that the noise blue also comes to function for us in a system of rule-regulated symbol activity. And it is a word, a linguistic fact, a rule-regulated symbol only insofar as it functions in this linguistic system. The noise blue becomes a mediating link between what can suggestively be called a rule-regulated calculus and a cluster of conditioned responses which binds us to our environment. I think where this gets us is closer to what Ilyenkov was talking about in discussing Marx's suggestion that a human being separates representation from his own activity. And in terms of, as a picture of development, of learning, as the development of all people, it's a picture in which we can think of it as conceptual development leading to more adequate picturing, which is something I'll defend a bit more. For Vygotsky, the mechanism that works here with the mother taking the child's gesture to be a pointing gesture is development towards an ideal form. Now, the ideal form is not a Platonic ideal. The ideal form is in reciprocal action. It's what people are enacting, and it's the sense in which others' activity can structure mine by me imitating it or participating in it directly. Others can take my actions as contributions and expand their value, and those with more mastery can positively constrain or simplify the action so I can complete certain mechanisms that I wouldn't be able to, certain functions I wouldn't be able to on my own, and thus I can pursue my own purposes as the child wanting the bottle can. In sum, acting with others expands our capacities and possibilities. In his theory of disability, Vygotsky wanted to stress that the goal of communism had to include that everyone is able to access the wealth of their culture, and that this could not simply happen, as Sasha Suvorov points out, through the maximization of free time, that we need separately to nurture the powers of each individual to use that free time for freedom. So the freedom in free time can't be presumed ahead of time. Okay, so Vygotsky stresses that these ideals, it's not just happens to be situated, and mum interprets this as a pointing gesture. These techniques or methods of behavior arising stereotypically, so uniformities of performance, in given situations, represent virtual, solidified, petrified, crystallized psychological forms that arose in remote times and the most primitive stages of cultural development of man, and in a remarkable way were preserved in the form of historical survivors, in the petrified and in a living state in the behavior of modern man. So the thing that's interesting about this is what Sellers, Vygotsky, and Ilyenkov are saying about the ways in which our conceptual capacities restructure something about the way that we are in the world, our relation to the world, and more importantly, the way in which our conceptual activity expands our capacities for relating to the world. So in Sellers' example of feeling sympathy for the bereaved is something which we unreflectively do, even something like that, it's not an innate category. It's something that we acquire through enculturation. So Ray summarizes it in the following way. For the child, what comes first before being able to understand bereavement as bereavement is mere conformity with a relevant ought-to-be rule. The trainer, her parents, slowly mould and orient her behavior so that it conforms to the uniformities of performance that are expected from a member of the community, without the child being actually aware of the complicated and inferential structure that comes with the full possession of the concept of bereavement and associated rules of action. What Ray is missing, I think the more and more important thing is that this is a process through which the child is not only able to act as though they are bereaved, but to express bereavement through their actions. And that this is a new way of feeling. This is a thus new way of relating to my world. What I find strangely missing from Sellers' account is the role of tools in structuring the uniformities of our performance. Tools are surely like a version of what Sellers describes in Language, Rules and Behavior as embodied generalizations. He said that rules are embedded are in flesh and sinew, not pen and ink, but they're surely in flesh and sinew as well as pen and ink. So to go back to Ilyenkov, only insofar as humans train the organs of their body on the objects created by humans for humans do they become the bearers of active forms of social and human activity which creates these objects. The thought of preceding generations is realized in sensuously perceived matter, in language and visual images, in books and statues and wood and bronze, in the form of places of worship and instruments of labor. In their origin, they are ideal because they embody the collective thinking of people. So part of this is the Solagian story we've had so far. Part of this is that a milk jug has the form that it does because it has continued to embody certain intentions between people in certain activities. So returning to the architect and the bee, Ilyenkov says absolutely the architect has the image of the house in his mind, as long as we remember that for Marx, the mind is not the head of the biological individual. The mind is the whole of inorganic nature, the whole of the environment implicated in our activity, not something individualized and Cartesian in this kind of way. So where that leads us is an embodied understanding of mind, whereby the architect builds a house not just in her head, but with the aid of her head by way of representation, directly on drawing paper. By doing so, she changes her inner condition, bringing it into the open and acting with it as though with an object different from herself. Modifying this reified subjective inner image, she also potentially changes the image of the real house. That is, she changes it ideally in its potentiality. So whereas ripples in the water are a sign of fish for the bird, the architect is able to bring the representation into this relation through the activity so that it acts as a representation. So in that way, it's a separation. It's not a direct extension. It's acting as. So this difference between architect and bee for Ilyenkov is a difference in social form. Ilyenkov spent a lot of time interested in disabled education in a home that was created along Vygotsky's principles, seeing how deaf and blind children were educated. Before this, in the typical Stalinist system, they were treated in Ilyenkov's evocative image like a cactus, something that you just they're there to sit and you feed them. Here, there was a focus on the child in terms of their potential, not in terms of their defects, but in terms of what they could do. But I want to look at a particular step, which will echo earlier moves, if you think back to the reaching gesture, except let's look at what the tool is doing here. The child does not want to eat with a spoon. He resists and tries as before to thrust his mouth into the bowl, but they don't let him. Instead, they stick something in between his mouth and the bowl, some sort of very inconvenient object, superfluous to the old mode. and this mediating link requires unfamiliar actions of him, actions the schemas for which are inscribed neither in the organic need itself nor in the object in itself, but only in the form and designated purpose of a spoon, towel, potty, table, chair, etc. So yeah, through their normative understanding within the activity. Now, there's something about this moment of alienation that Ilyenkov is describing about that could make people feel quite uncomfortable, because you're enforcing this onto the child, and how do we know that the conceptual, in an embodied sense, understanding that we're giving the child really is development? I think I quite like the way that Seabuff describes the role of picturing for Sellers, that we aren't ever in a position to say, yes, this is the path of development. So to ask, how do we know one conceptual structure is preferable to another, is to misunderstand our situation. We have no independent standpoint for addressing this question. The comparative success of a later conceptual structure we ascertain by successfully living in it. The idea of an increase in pictorial adequacy amounts to the thoughts that we can rationally or structurally improve our practical access to the world we encounter, because we can formulate a comparative sense in which we achieve our epistemic ends more successfully. So this achieving ends more successfully, we can again bring back to the level of the child learning to use the spoon. This is a student, a deaf and blind student from the school, who became Ilyenkov's friend, became a psychology professor, despite the apparent impairments that he had. And he explains the child in this case can be passive or can resist, but then the child makes an attempt to help the teacher and to complete the action that was begun with the teacher. The child asserts his independence for the first time at the end of this cooperative action. So it's this sense in which there's a kind of slight free fall where the alienation might go anywhere, and then it goes into this kind of metabolism where the child is able to appropriate this, to use the spoon. So now it becomes a freedom. Okay, I want to bring this back to some of my own research with chronic pain. So lots of people have heard of phantom limb, where someone, let's say I lost my hand in an explosion, but I still have a pain in my hand that I've lost. Big puzzle throughout history, and people used to do all kinds of horrific things like amputate more of the arm to try to control the pain, but of course the pain is still here in the absent hand. And yeah, this innovative technique by Villanora Ramachandran, where what you do is you put someone into a box where their arm is mirror reflected onto their other arm, so they see their present arm reflected onto their absent arm, and they wiggle their present arm, and the pain is able to disappear from the other arm, because it's a kind of rewiring that goes on here. So this is still a very popular therapy that does have a lot of success for people with chronic pain. But the point is that through this mediation, we see that there's a kind of, let's say, misprediction that goes on in the case of chronic pain. And that's the case for most chronic pain. So most people with chronic pain don't have any tissue damage. It's a kind of, sense in which they're not able to get out of representing this particular relation. So I worked with 14 separate participants with musculoskeletal chronic pain, and they chose a piece of music that they enjoy, that they identify with, and they put on lots of movement sensors all over their body, and they performed various activities. We did role plays and stuff, and as they moved, the music was filtered to their movement, and I interviewed them simple thing. Here's some of the interview fragments from the participants. Points of pain were in tune with the music. It was comforting. It made me think of the blind guy who uses sound to guide his movement. It's a little bit like that. You're creating an extra sense that you can then use. It could detect stress, difficulty, or discomfort. With things that caused quite a lot of discomfort, it got quite loud. It was sensitive enough to detect what I was feeling and reflect it in the effect, the volume. Now, one thing you could say about that is, no, it wasn't. It was just a low-pass filter and a high-pass filter, and yet it's appropriated into this situation in a way that the participant found powerful and that allowed greater freedom of movement. So in the Solagian framing, we're making the patterns that govern this scrutable. And then going back to the Ilyenkov quote, it's the sense in which man makes his life activity itself the object of his willing consciousness. And a big part of that was that there was me sitting there framing this in a particular way. It's not the tool in itself that was doing this. There was a kind of social situation there that we were in together, an activity. So Kyrill, I found this fascinating, and she's not the only one that expressed it like this. There's an element of validation. You know, I'm feeling my pain, and it's so subjective. Nobody else really gets it. But if you can actually hear when you're doing something associated with the pain, it makes you feel like it's not just you. Someone else can hear. Something can react to it. So Ilyenkov says, the ability to see the world like a human means to see through the eyes of another person, through the eyes of all people. So in this sense, through public objects, whether they be a teapot, a piece of music, or our languagings, we're able to orient one another to the world as well as orienting ourselves to it. Of course, the participants I worked with, so if you have chronic pain, you probably can't keep a job. So most of them were forced into unemployment. Some of them had maybe a temporary job, and they were really experiencing very high levels of social isolation as well. If you have chronic pain and you're entering situations, no one can see on your face that you're in pain. So with acute pain, you see it. If someone else doesn't know that you're in pain, there's almost a sense that they won't believe you. And many of them had just withdrawn from going into any social interaction because of the uncertainty. So my situation, where we're super structured, they were kind of safe with it. I said, here are all of the things that are going to happen. But they go into a society that's just structured in ways that they find hugely alienating. And so much of the pain that they feel, it seems, is actually just the pain of no longer being full-fledged people in their society. And having been people who saw themselves in certain ways, had certain identity markers, they'd suddenly lost. And to everyone else, it's just, oh, but it's you, but just in pain. And we don't have a rich enough kind of vocabulary to understand what that is and to know kind of how to restructure things so as to include them in our activity. So, what is a person? Ilyenkov says that a personality, meaning a person, meaning the quality of being a person as well as the qualities of a person, exists as a node in a network of mutual relations which arise between individuals in the process of collective activity. Inside a body of an individual, there actually exists not a personality, but its one-sided abstract projection, realized by a dynamic of nervous processes. A person is not within an individual body, but precisely external to it, in the interrelations of the given individual body with another body, through things located in the space between them and locking them, as it were, into one body, controlled, as it were, by one soul. And I'm reminded of the interesting recasting of the late Sellers, the Sellers of process ontology, where he sees a theory of the person in Sellers, kind of, it's very much a de re, not de dicto reading. Instead of being individuated in terms of its differing in matter among members of the same essential form, species, a particular human being, for example Socrates, would be reconceived as the locus of a dynamic field, as a locus or dynamic field. The collective resonance of these nested processes sustains in relative stability through change what we might call the Socrates event, itself individuated by the difference it makes to the processes it presupposes, engenders, and encounters. Ilyenkov says a person is the individualized expression of the historically accumulated energy of a social ensemble, capable of breaking historically obsolete forms of human relation, opposing the rigid templates, stereotypes of thinking and action. I'd like to give an example which I found really touching from some of the autobiographical reflections of the philosopher Eva Kitte, talking about her severely cognitively impaired daughter. Kitte says, "Music is her life, and Beethoven her best friend. At our home, listening to the Empress Concerto, she gazes out the window, enthralled, occasionally turning to us with a twinkle in her eye when she anticipates some really good parts." So it's interesting what's going on here in terms of Beethoven, in terms of how Beethoven is relating them to each other, and the sense in which her daughter, through these relations, has, as she describes it, changed her understanding of the capacities for flourishing, for freedom, of someone with severe cognitive impairments. So to conclude with Ilyenkov, a person is the power to expand the scope of creative activity, to change our mutual relations to the world. Thanks.
So I just wanted to, thank you for the talk. It was really fascinating, and I particularly like the way that I feel like that you connected the different approaches to like cognition, that people have in different modes of cognition in terms of within the human species, in terms of disability, as well as kind of across the human species, or across species rather, I need to say. So I was curious if there is a sense in which, how do you think is the best way to try and balance not being kind of being so precise that it kind of gets into more of an exclusionary thing where there's people we unpeople, and then how do we also at the same time though have something broad enough, but also that is able to do the work that we want a work-like person to do.
Yeah, well, I think what Sellers, Vygotsky, and Ilyenkov would recommend is just don't play the Peter Singer game of what essential characteristics do we need to have until someone's a person. There's just the wrong direction and already the wrong framing. That if we look at the kind of social forms that people are engaged in, the kind of networks and ensembles that they form in these groups, that's what is structuring them as a person. So it's a process, it's not an individuated set of essential characteristics. So it is precise, and I think that a lot of the precision is in Sellers. So I think this is totally works with a full space of reasons framing. The problem is just I'm kind of noting the ways in which, if we say that, if we have this kind of line that language is the barrier, then I think that's problematic. But if we're like, no, it's not language, actually. There's all of these, it's not just languagings, it's milk juggings and Beethovenzings, which is what Sellers says in his essay on what a person is, that we need to move into that kind of direction, then yeah, we can have a process ontological, precise definition, as Dionysus gives in the quote that I give, and in his excellent chapter in his new book.
I think
Yeah,
I'm largely in sympathy with your reading here in general, but just for the sake of pushing back on it a bit, using certain aspects of the normative tradition that you're working out from in Sellers, even if they are aspects that I myself think are flawed in particular ways. So coming out of the Hegelian dimension within which personhood is configured, you know, someone like Brandom, for example, will say that personhood has formal requirements involving structures of authority and responsibility based on mutual recognition. So I'm just curious if your model of capacities as socially structured in this sense that you're giving it comes into tension with that view, or if you have a sense that it's in some sense compatible with it.
Yeah, well, so it's interesting because I think Ilyankov is very much aware of this, and he wants to explicitly say that he's trying to find a more Marxist materialist way to think about the structure. So he talks about mutual activity, and yeah, there's something about recognition maybe that certainly in the form that as McDowell sees it is a bit more like it is a bit too much kind of I am recognizing, whereas like mutual activity, us getting things done together, there's a like yeah, there's still a sense of in which I'm doing the seeing what someone else is capable of, licensed to do, but in terms of this, it's not just like at an assertive level, like what can they assert, but this kind of space of capacities and possibilities that is the ideal form is I attribute to the other, like just a direct vision of here is what there is to do, given that we're in this activity together. And yeah, so you can have a kind of more embodied version of that at least Ilyenko thinks language is a part of, but other things can also get you there. So there's like an assertion, which is not actually an assertion, but like an activity that we're kind of engaged in, yeah.
My understanding, I'm an architect actually. I'm not a bee. I was once a bee, but now I'm an architect. My understanding of the Marx quote about bees and architects is, and I can't remember the German word that was used, but I think Marx meant something more akin to a builder than an architect. Mm-hmm. I think this is kind of interesting in relation to the previous talk as well, where we're talking about the division of labour, because that's a very obvious division of labour, where you have architects who are supposedly the thinkers and the builders who do the kind of sensuous action. I just wonder whether, assuming I'm correct about that, which I think I am, if that changes it gives a different, slightly different nuance to what you were saying.
Right. Yeah. So architect kind of invites this sort of above kind of almost dualist vision, and I agree that builder is different because the builders are going to be doing the activity. So Ilyenkov is sort of saying, look, we're bees and architects, so he's just pointing to the fact that there is this kind of B level nonetheless. So we don't want to just say, look, here's these two different types of things. Just like how is it that at some point what bees are doing is not what bees are doing and is what is producing persons producing,